I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Joshua Wodak to you, who joins us from the University of Western Sydney, where he works in the School of Humanities and Communication Art. Josh's work is sort of at the intersection of science and technology studies and environmental arts and humanities. And I've known him for quite a while as a member of what you could call the second generation of environmental humanities researchers in Australia. But Josh is not only a researcher and a writer, he's also an artist. And in fact, he's just told me that he has a work that is in an exhibition that's currently on at the University of Frankfurt's gallery. And the exhibition is quite germane, actually, to the topic of this book. Fixing Futures, Planetary Futures Beyond Speculation and Control. And Josh tells me that that exhibition is on for another few months.
Yeah, definitely till end of August.
Yeah, till end of August. So Frankfurt's not all that far away. So if you're heading down that way, as I say, Josh has a work of art in that exhibition at the moment. Well, he's also a member of the kind of a centre of excellence, which is the kind of Australian equivalent of the German cluster of excellence. So Josh is a member of a successful centre of excellence in wait for it, synthetic biology. So he's been working a lot, as you'll hear, really looking in a very clear-eyed and courageous way, not only at the mess that we're in, but also at sort of, some of the more sort of extreme techno fixes that are kind of being proposed for that as well. This is his second visit here, and when he was here with us last, he shared some work in progress from the book that he was writing, which has now been published. Ta-da! Here it is. So this is also sort of somewhat by way of a book launch. So congratulations, Josh. Great to see this beautiful book in print.
Thank you.
And there's another German connection because Josh has had an affiliation with the Käthe Hamburger Center for Apocalyptic Studies, CALAS, in Heidelberg. Hey, hi. In fact, this book has been published in their series, the CALAS series in apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic studies. Well, you're going to learn a lot more about it, but I was having a look at it last night, and one sentence really sort of jumped out at me as kind of the core of what he's trying to do here. The question is, how do we become fully present to the rupture unfolding around us? How do we become fully present to the rupture unfolding around us? So maybe we'll get some clues. Josh's work is wildly inter- and post-disciplinary and very playful and creative. So hold on to your seats. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction, and lovely to be back here at MESH. I recognise a few familiar faces from when I was here bang on 2 years ago, and also just want to extend a thanks to Christoph for the sort of behind the scenes communication with making today possible. So largely what I'm going to do today is just present a very heavily edited, abridged version of one of the chapters, but I wanted to give you just a 1 minute introduction of the book itself, because otherwise to give you the chapter context. So as Kate was saying, this is the book. It is free to have a PDF or EPUB, so I'm not trying to encourage anyone to buy a prohibitively expensive hardcover, but I'm really, really pleased that it's published in open access. So that's a long URL there, or just Googling the title or something. But what is the actual book about itself in sort of literally a 1-minute overview? The book is essentially a response to one paragraph in this article by Nigel Clarke. I'll read out in a second. I call this the topic of the book. And this is the article titled Volatile World, Vulnerable Bodies Confronting Abrupt Climate Change. When he says this, so what are we to make of abrupt climate change now that academic science, popular science writing and Hollywood cinema have all warmed to the idea of sudden threshold transitions in climate systems? He therefore says the issue is unlikely to recede. Further, we have also passed the point at which progressive social thought can content itself by keeping a critical distance from the substantive claims of the natural sciences and entered a situation which cries out for a degree of fidelity to events unfolding around us. These spaces I've just put in, this is all just one continuous paragraph, which would seem to me to imply at least provisional commitment to an idea of how our physical world actually works. My gamble with the usual provisos about decision making under conditions of unknowability, and you've got this fantastic ecolithic project about unknown unknowns, so some potential resonances there, is that we must front up to the past reality and future likelihood of crossing climate thresholds. So the book Petrified, Living During Rupture of Life on Earth, is my attempt to take what I call like the proper scholarship, which is not what I do, of people like Nigel Clarke, and bring it into line with this one scene from Blade Runner. Is that showing up? And the book is like structured like a play in 3 acts. So this first part of Nigel Clarke's paragraph, I map onto the first part of the desert tortoise dilemma, that you're in a desert walking along in the sand, when all of a sudden you look down and you see a tortoise, it's crawling toward you. The second act about the dire, you reach down, you flip the tortoise over on its back, the tortoise lays on its back, beating its legs, it's belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't, not without your help. And the chapter I'm going to share today is from Act 3, The Dice, which is all about you're not helping, why is that? So what would be helpful in this day and age against all of the crises that we're facing? And the reason I also share this is that, yes, what I'm going to present today is a very, I don't want to use the term case study, but it's a study of a particular rookery, a particular nursery of green sea turtles. But turtles in the book are metaphorical, poetic, literal, conceptual, epistemological, and also actual turtles. So I just wanted to share that this is, today we're talking about real turtles, but the book's trying to talk about turtles in all sorts of other ways as well. So let's get started. The chapter in the book is called It's All Fun and Games Till Someone Loses an Island. I don't know if there would be a German equivalent for that, but we have a saying in English that often a parent will say to a child, it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. Yeah. Also like don't run with scissors. So here's sort of playing on that a little bit. So there's 6 scenes. Scene 1, game on. Myrtle, Tukulu and Tuturi are 3 green sea turtles of the species Chelonia mydas, so named in 2016 following their capture by park rangers and conservation biologists who glue satellite tags to their shell tops and spray paint large X's across their shell centres. Satellites then monitor their behaviour for the next 12 odd months until shell growth dispels the tag, causing it to fall to the sea floor, now anonymised once more. But this is not the first capture, track and tag. More detailed data shows that for Myrtle, this goes back to 1992, for Tukulu, 2006, and for Tuturi, 1984. In the more recent taggings and trackings, however, the gameplay and its stakes are altogether different. These 3 turtles are the only ones named in a publicity campaign for an experimental conservation project in 2016. The relevance of the traditional familiar forms of conservation, yesteryear conservation, is disappearing at an exponential rate. The conservation and ideas of concepts, say, of 2006, 1992 or 1984 are rendered completely redundant, because for these turtles, as well as life at large, the world a few decades ago may as well be another geological and climatological epoch. What then is conservation to become, given this new epoch is manifestly incomparable to the halcyon yesteryears of the 20th century? And where on earth do we draw a line in the sand if conservation in the Anthropocene amounts to bioengineering, not only in ecosystems, but in planetary scale evolution itself? These three turtles have borne and still bear witness to this transition from recent conservation ideas to current conservation ideas, since what is at stake is not the existential plight of their sole species, but rather the fate of their entire superfamily Chelonia. As a team of conservation biologists remarked in their 2018 article titled "Where Have All the Turtles Gone and Why Does It Matter?", the fate of turtles is especially tragic in light of their distinction as paragons of evolutionary success. They survived everything nature could throw at them from both Earth and outer space, for example, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, but will they survive modern humans? Looking at conservation ethics through a deep time lens, these three turtles are synecdoche for the plight of life at large at the advent of the Anthropocene. Their fate entwines their superfamily's 120 million year record of enduring not only the two mass extinctions prior to this one currently unfolding, but also the many varied unnamed ruptures that are part and parcel of long-term survival, and yet their fate seems to hinge upon radical and risky experiments to construe a conservation that could counteract their extinction debt. The response to the plight of Myrtle, Tukulu and Tuturi sought to understand the question of where have all the turtles gone and why does it matter by tracking where turtles are going at present. Peering down on them from satellites over 2016 to 17 confirms some staggering feats of green sea turtle migration, including that they swim up to 2,500 kilometres to reach their nesting site from as far as Vanuatu, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. Each nesting migration is an unvaried return to the exact beach of birth, navigating by Earth's magnetic field, a field which has aperiodically flipped polarity many a time, for when one's habitation extends over 120 million years, the homing beacon fixates on points in space and time as fluid as the rise and fall of entire continents. For these three turtles, their sole destination is a drop in the ocean, Raine Island. Scene 2, artificial rain versus Raine Island. Rain is a microcosm for how life did not happen on, but rather to Earth. After all, the island is biogenic. Like all coral caves, its origins lie not only in a life form, coral, but also in the death of this same life form, composed, as it were, of skeletal coral remains. Once rain became an established landmass not only year-round, but year in, year out, life then happened to this microcosmic Earth on a whole other level. For coral is not the only way life, or at least life's excrement, is literally woven into the island's fabric itself. Next came an Earth suffused with life from the top down. Shit happens, and it happens from the sky. Biogenic contribution to creating rain came from guano, when dried bird shit accumulates on a semi-solid foundation, say rocks or sand above sea level. Guano reacts with existing sand, sediment and water to make top-down bedrock, a mirror process to how coral aggregates sediment to make bottom-up bedrock. The guano bedrock then lays the foundation for soil and grass to form, which adds to existing attractions for birds to nest. This creates more guano, which amplifies the cycle of shit-fueled land ho. To the naked eye, it appears obvious how corals change K geomorphology. No coral equals no island. But the way guano can change K geomorphology is hidden from plain sight. Chemical reactions started by the bird shit catalyze, quote, a unique form of reef island in which a phosphatic cap formed from the downward leaching of guano plays an important part. While this process is endemic to all phosphatic cap islands, unique refers only to rain, for reasons borne out by this island's creation and features which makes for a microcosm of Earth. The sentence comes from Raine Island, its past and present status and future implications of climate change, a 2008 report by geomorphologist Professor David Hopley. The sentence's abrupt ending begs a cascading series of questions. An important part in what? Important in catalyzing rain? Important for rain's resistance to oceanic erosion? Important for marine and terrestrial life which depend on rain for breeding and nesting? The possible answer, a definitive answer, is absent from the 101 pages of the report, encapsulates why the guano phosphate cap has life and death consequences for turtle nesting. Given turtles drive to nest only where they are born, nesting sites are the existential thread connecting successive generations. And given Raine is the largest remaining Chelonia mydas nesting site in the world, and thus the most important green sea turtle rookery, the island makes for a telling microcosm of the stakes at play in conservation at large. Since geographically distinct populations of Chelonia mydas do not interbreed, each is effectively constrained to its respective nesting site. The only other population in Australia, some 2,000 kilometres south in the southern Great Barrier Reef, makes Raine the primary preserve of the entire northern Great Barrier Reef population. In addition, Raine's rookery has the longest known use in the world, having nurtured turtles for at least the last millennium. Thus, the story of Raine Island takes us from Myrtle to Kulu and to Turi, to Chelonia mydas, then to turtles at large, and beyond to life at large, because turtles are but one of many life forms dependent on this drop in the ocean. 130 years of European observations have identified 84 bird species nesting on Raine, making it, quote, one of, if not the most important tropical seabird nesting site on the Great Barrier Reef. And, like green sea turtles' mammoth migrations, the birds connect Raine to distant corners of the globe. This island, a mere 3 square kilometres, 100 kilometres off the mainland, is globally interconnected to distant corners of the planet by the migratory feats of those nesting here. If Raine is a drop in the ocean, it shows how all drops are connected, far and wide. Myrtle, to Kulu and to Turi were born before 1981, when the global importance of the refugia was first recognised by establishing the Raine Island Corporation. These 3 turtles herald from the last generation before the geomorphology of the phosphatic cap began to play an important part in the survival of their species. By the time Hopley published his 2008 report, the stakes around the refugia's protective status had been raised, and the island's management had been transferred from the corporation to the Queensland state government just 1 year prior. The stakes were raised again when it was subsequently reclassified as a, quote, nature refuge, and then as a, quote, national park (scientific). The latter holds the most stringent status and highest level of protection in Australian law, including limiting all access to, quote, scientific research and essential management only. Talk, though, is cheap. While it is already dubious whether such strictures hold up at the scale of Raine, at a planetary scale, all legal protections are revealed to be null and void for the unfolding rupture of life on Earth. Arbitrary boundaries that demarcate a nature refuge are empty gestures against underwater heat waves come heat floods, when warming waters never subside and rising waters never recede. Scene 3, ramping up. If Raine is a microcosm for how life happened to, rather than on Earth, turtles demonstrate just how entangled biotic forces are with the abiotic planet itself. Such entanglement is especially problematic for fledgling turtles for whom Earth is incubator and protector. Burrows keep eggs warm enough, cool enough and dry enough, and hold them deep enough and long enough to hatch without being cooked, drowned, eaten or prematurely unearthed. Each existential challenge is just a smattering from biophysical limits to life. Too hot equals die inside the egg. Too cold equals insufficient growth inside the egg. Too much water equals drown inside the egg. Too little water equals dehydrate inside the egg. Such is life and death for green sea turtles. But on Raine, the unique form of solid phosphatic rock poses distinct existential challenges. During nesting seasons, upwards of 20,000 individuals may burrow at the same time, redistributing so much sand over the island that they unintentionally construct ramps from the beach to the raised phosphate centre. In search of better sand for burrowing, or due to overcrowding of other turtles on the beach, some climb these ramps to nest on the raised central platform. These ramps are the only means up or down, because the edge of the phosphate platform has eroded, creating a cliff with a metre or so drop to the beach below. Platform hatchlings then need the accidental ramps created by adults to still be there so they can get down onto the beach and into the sea. The first existential challenge for those platform birthing or hatching is to be able to ramp down with all of the entailed vicissitudes. Because a ramp constructed today is as ephemeral as tomorrow, given the winds, hurricanes, surf swell, or burrowing by subsequent turtles over the 60 days of incubation. For adults though, there is an additional predicament, both cognitive and proprioceptive. Chelonia and mydas live their whole lives in water other than when on Raine. Being on land is the exception to their rule. Following birth, the first 40 years are spent at sea. Having reached maturity, females then return to the beach of their own birth once every 2 to 6 years for a nesting season, nesting 4 to 6 times per season. Having swum up to 2,500 kilometres to return to Raine, they haul a 130 kilogram torso across tropical sands in 35 to 40 degree heat, negotiate their way through the thousands of their kind doing likewise, locate a site, then burrow for hours on end to create a nest. By the time they've finished laying their eggs, their energy levels have plummeted, making for a dehydrated and delirious return to sea. With energy repositories barely sufficient to provide motion toward the sea, the wherewithal to search for a ramp is wanting. Unable to negotiate the cliff edge, many exhausted turtles fall over, landing on their back on the hot beach sand. Back to front turtle flipping has subsequently become an endeavour whenever scientists and park rangers visit Raine during nesting season. They walk the cliff-based perimeter, stepping around those nesting on the beach, to manually flip hundreds of turtles back onto their front. At first, staff drag them on surfboard-like platforms across the beach to get them back into the sea. As demand increases, they introduce little diesel-powered tractors to wheel them back into the sea. Manual turtle flipping is a reactive intervention, meaning the reaction follows after an event has occurred. Reactive interventions suffer from bleedingly oblivious intrinsic limits, especially when applied to human-caused environmental damage. First, we create catastrophes, and then reactively attempt cleanups that are often completely insufficient and haphazard. Our reactive mentality is already problematic for discrete incidents with proximal cause and effect chains, such as oil spills. But it is absolutely delusional when confronted with distal, non-linear phenomena that are discrete in neither space nor time, such as climate change. Coaxing oil back into barrels is self-evidently hazardous. Coaxing greenhouse gases back into earthly sequestration is self-evidently preposterous. The logical alternative to reactive interventions is also fairly self-evident. Proactive interventions attempt to anticipate rather than react. First, extrapolate from the present to an anticipated future consequence of present phenomena. Then, intervene to thwart the undesirable future from eventuating. Or so the logic goes, where the proof in the pudding is that the originally anticipated future does not eventuate. The premise is that pre-intervention is better than cure. On Raine, the first such proactive intervention can be seen in the low fences constructed around the cliff edge to stop turtles going over. Now, the turtle is prevented from flipping onto its back, provided the fence exerts sufficient resistance. Just as turtle flipping or fence construction are surface-level interventions on this earthly microcosm, there is much more than meets the eye in terms of what conservation could or should become if it is to be in keep with the velocity of biophysical change afoot. In particular, there is the inheritance of an historical legacy by which our species acquire geological agency and by which the ethics of current conservation debates ought to take heed. Scene 4, staging and intervention. In the case of Raine Island, the legacy that prefigures current conservation debates heralds from 1842, when a bark hailing from England was wrecked on a reef 40 kilometres from Raine. Many such ships ran aground on the Great Barrier Reef, which led the British colonial authorities to build a beacon on Raine in the form of a non-light emitting lighthouse. The island was selected not so much for its position, but rather for its phosphate cap, which guaranteed its relative year-to-year landmass stability and also provided on-site building materials. In 1844, an expedition began building the beacon with rocks mined from the phosphate cap and timber salvaged from the 1842 wreck. So followed a settlement of convicts consigned to build the beacon and their captors who enforced their labour. The island peak was now the tower, neighboured by an inverse indentation from the quarried central phosphate platform. Following the coral and birdshit biogenesis, Raine's first non-indigenous incursion constituted a distinctly modern form of anthrogenesis. The legacy of this anthrogenesis ran amok for the following few decades once the beacon was built and Raine was once again uninhabited and unvisited. When intensive guano mining began in 1882, tens of thousands of tons of guano were mined from the island's central platform to manufacture phosphorus that was shipped all around the globe. Raine's shit-catalysed topography was distributed onto farming fields far and wide as phosphorus was foundational to developing industrial agriculture. Unlike the explicitly coerced beacon builders, coercion was now implicit between Chinese labourers and their European overlords. The distinction alludes to the vastly differentiated agency, will and responsibility for how the anthropos acquired the Anthropocene's geological agency. The legacy of this second stage of anthrogenesis on Raine ran amok for the following few decades, as Raine became uninhabited once more after all mining had been exhausted. In combination, both stages of anthrogenesis constituted a biogeochemical upheaval of Raine. With the upper guano removed, rainwater could now penetrate the raised central platform substrate. Chemically reacting with the phosphate, seeping rainwater then eroded the substrate away, in turn eroding the cliff edges of the central platform. Further, the brine bedrock that lies directly under the beach sands, where turtles nest, has progressively shifted under the burrowing area by way of phosphate transported by water that has leached through the eroded cap, making, in effect, a solid platform under the beach sands. The shifting bedrock appears to be the terminus for David Hopley's 2008 statement that the downward leaching of guano plays an important part. Conservation biologists were initially baffled as to the plummeting hatchling numbers, hence Hopley's ambiguity about what on earth was the important part. Subsequent research revealed that since the bedrock is not porous, the water table is increasingly rising up the beach area where turtles build their nests. The bedrock thus retains falling rain under the beach, and it exacerbates seawater rising through the beach sand. Thus, from coral, birdshit, water, sand, human industrial intermingling, a rising seawater level was drowning the vast majority of incubating eggs. By 2014, the ratio of hatchlings versus drowning in their eggs had become critical. Whereas 370,000 hatchlings represented an average nesting season, all other things being equal, conservation biologists estimated 2,500 hatchlings that season. Government agencies reactively intervened by experimentally increasing egg distance from the water table. Transporting massive engineering vehicles onto Raine, they raised a 100 by 100 metre beach section 1 metre, redistributing the equivalent of 6 Olympic swimming pools of sand from the front beach area to the rear, with the experiment indicating a less dire sink to swim ratio. The state government proposed a larger scale beach reprofiling. But instead of fronting up the 8 million Australian dollars required to do so, the government advertised for private sponsorship. David Attenborough lent his voice to the fundraising video, inviting the viewer to, quote, be part of the largest green turtle recovery project in history. Attenborough has a long association with Raine, having first filmed there in 1957, and, like a turtle returning to its birth site for its first nesting season, he returned to Raine a half-century later, filming the 2014 fence building and beach raising interventions. Featuring the experiments in his major 3-part BBC series, Great Barrier Reef, the project suddenly received international attention. A consortium of companies, NGOs, state agencies, universities and traditional owners responded to the calls for desperate measures, and, with funds secured, the Raine Island Recovery Project launched in 2016. The title is unwittingly ironic, recovering rain by literally recovering the beach in its own sand. A larger recovering intervention in 2017 bore a title befitting the neoliberal conservation, Operation Sand Dune. After all, such conservation is nature incorporated, environmental conservation in the neoliberal age, as the editors Brown Bushler, Wolfram Dressler and Robert Fletchler lament. Myrtle, Tuturi and Tukulu were tagged and tracked as part of analysing the comings and goings of adult turtles during the Raine Island Recovery Project. Indigenous school children named Myrtle and Tukulu from their respective local indigenous languages. But it was multinational fossil fuel company BHP that named Tuturi, a fringe privilege gained from their principal funding of the whole 5-year project. Conservation through bioengineering, outsourced by a state government, funded by a fossil fuel company. A deal with the devil it may be, but conservationists who have wagered this game for decades are putting all options on the table because the floor is already soaked through with the rising seas. One could take the moral high ground and protest the bitter irony of the funding source, but the moral high ground is not as obvious as refusing to stand on the reprofiled beach area. Without that sponsorship, the second beach level raising and ancillary experiment support would not have occurred in time. When populations plummet, so does a luxury of time which to respond. The question posed to conservation then is not just where do we draw a line in the sand, but when. Scene 5, exclamation point extreme. When Attenborough returned to Raine in 2014, he drew a perplexing line in the sand whose demarcation made a mockery of any protests against intervention, while also revealing that any such interventions amount to empty gestures when viewed on any meaningful scale. In his 2014 documentary, Attenborough unintentionally shows up human hubris as a hollow conceit when he profiles the work of conservation biologists who count hatchlings from the reprofiled beach area that they have steered into a shallow trench. The team from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority left each hatchling from the trench, putting them onto the beach to continue their shell-to-sea journey. Attenborough concludes the segment about rain by interviewing the project leader, Andy Dunstan, on the beach raising experiment. Quote, "It's confirmation that Andy and his team have found the right way to restore this vital breeding area. But for the young hatchlings, the trials of life have only just begun. Each new arrival will have to make a perilous dash to the ocean. Now they're on their own. Andy and his team must not interfere at this stage. Inevitably, the tiny defenseless hatchlings attract scores of predators. This statement draws a line in the sand on the basis that Andy and his team must not interfere at this stage. Once the hatchlings leave the trench, it appears as if the tiny hatchlings have crossed some invisible line, leaving the protection of human hands. Human hands that have raised their nesting beach so that they did not drown as eggs, flipped their parents onto their backs so that they did not die of dehydration, built fences and even trenches to aid adults and hatchlings respectively. But now, the hatchlings return back to the yonder side of nature, the one that is red in tooth and claw, with all human aid withdrawn. For every 1,000 hatchlings, only 70 make it to the sea. On the journey from shell to sea, crabs or birds eat those whose trials of life end after they have only just begun. For every 1,000 that make it to the sea, only one makes it to adulthood. On the journey into the sea, tiger sharks wait so close to the shoreline that their entire backs are exposed above water. Granting safe passage from shell to sea would thus go a long way to greater numbers reaching adulthood. If aiming to help plummeting populations, why go only so far as flipping individuals back onto their front and propping up portions of their nesting area over the rising seas? Socially okay to capture, tag and track, to manually flip, to transport on tractors, to instill cliff top barriers, to raise the beach height, but Having partially restored shelter to their refugia through all this intervention, now they're on their own. Andy and his team must not interfere at this stage. Why on earth is everything so far considered acceptable, but sheltering hatchlings from predators on their shell-to-sea journey is not? Worse still, why tell ourselves we made right when so much more remains to even remotely get things back up the right way round? What on earth prompted Attenborough to set the limits to intervening here? It is not as if the Raine Island Recovery Project has any means to address the myriad existential challenges facing coral beneath the island, turtles within the island, and seabirds atop the island. To boot, the acuteness of the situation is well illustrated by the fact that the conservation mentality driving the project shows the same insatiable urge to cannibalize Earth as industrial capitalism, here in the form of a fossil fuel company, that it depends on for its primary funding. Hopley demonstrates this in this report's sobering rationale. Hopley demonstrates this in his report's sobering rationale for Raine's present status and future implications of climate change. Quote, "Nearby cays, before they disappear, their value may be in providing the sand for any replenishment on Raine Island. This will be a no-loss position, as we a few years as sea level rises, these cays will disappear completely and their sand resource lost forever." Thus far, the universities and companies who paid to attach their names to such conservation of bioengineering have celebrated success so-called in their marketing public relations. Yet the fact that the neighbouring cays are disappearing under the water remains set aside. And even worse, they remain entirely mute on the acute existential threat that was subsequently unearthed when the project was only halfway through its tenure. Like reptiles in general, turtle sex is determined by egg incubation temperature. Below a certain sand temperature threshold, turtles are born male. Above, a female. As adults, myrtle, tukulu and tuturi herald from the 1970s and 80s, when one male Chelonia mydas was born for every 6.6 females. By the time the beaches were being raised, this had changed to one male for every 116 females. In response to these findings from her research, turtle scientist Cameron Allen declared in 2018 that, quote, "This is extreme, like capital letters extreme, exclamation point extreme. We're talking a handful of males to hundreds and hundreds of females. We were shocked. From this point on, all talk, though still cheap, should be in capital letters, all the same. Exclamation point extreme." When Attenborough crouched over hatchlings in the recovered heightened sands, he declared that, quote, "For the young hatchlings, the trials of life have only just begun. Beyond the usual proximal predators, the trials of life are actually at the behest of the distal suspect that is murder most foul, anthropogenic climate change. Behind the far more pernicious threat to the turtle's ongoing existence lies the same non-linear causation that is raising the water table up the beach. From climate change too wet, they drown. From climate change too hot, they cook. Having drawn a line in the sand about not interfering in hatchling shell-to-sea passage, how would conservation ethics prefigure any intervention that could flip their male-to-female sex ratio back to 1 to 100, let alone 1 to 50 or 1 to 10? It is here, in bioengineering as conservation, that the stakes find their fullest expression in risk, complexity and uncertainty, intervening directly into evolution itself to forestall extinction. Such interventions are about catalyzing effectively instantaneous phenotypic and/or genotypic modification for future descendants to inherit their modified traits. Say a discernible phenotypic or genotypic trait takes 10 millennia to appear across a species, and scientists induce a discernible inherited trait in 10 years in a population of the species. From an evolutionary time perspective, that is effectively instantaneous. Therein, redressing the sex ratio would necessitate radical interventions into both ecosystems and evolution. The risks, complexity and uncertainty in this predicament are palpable. The time frame to act is now or never. The consequences quite literally determine the procreative viability of sea turtles due to the extinction prospects arising from one male for every 10 females, or one for every 100, or one for every 1,000. Against the rapidly diminishing time frame for any efficacious intervention, what would such bioengineering entail? More to the point, assuming any such means, vexing questions arise as to whether we could or should. The burning question thus becomes, what would such risky and radical conservation look like for Raine's turtles? Last scene, scene 6. Endgame, buck stop here. Once again, even for matters such as the utter urgency of reconceiving conservation at large, an historical legacy remains to be heeded, like that of Raine's beacon. Because the climate system has a roughly 5-decade lag between emissions and their consequences manifesting, the change in the Raine Island's sea turtles' sex ratio from 1 to 6.6 to 1 to 116 in 2018 was due to emissions made around the time Attenborough first visited Raine in 1957. So now is already entirely too late. This means that to be anything other than an empty gesture, only a seismic and successful intervention into the Chelonia mydas genotype could stop the sex ratio going from its current 1 to 116 to 1 to 1,160, all other things being equal, let alone bring it back from 1 to 116 to 1 to 6.6. Will Attenborough lend his voice to campaigns to sculpt the Chelonia mydas genotype via millions of dollars in corporate donations? Will there be public outcry or even public debate about such proposals? Instead, our now is stuck in the meantime of ad hoc reactive interventions. One being to relocate eggs to cooler sands, including on neighbouring islands. Another being to lower sand temperature by modifying the albedo ratio, say by adding light-coloured sand to nest tops. Sand which could not stay on top for long, given how much sand the burrowing turtles redistribute. Uncertainty also abounds as to whether imported sand could bring fresh existential challenges to incubation mortality at the microbial scale from microorganisms that inhabit coral cay sand. To circumvent these ground level problems, another proposal simply moves higher up, suggesting shade cloth be used to modify the albedo ratio suspended above the vicissitudes of sand morphology and terrestrial microbes. Such experiments have already taken place in a handful of key rookeries across the globe, including over the Mon Repos rookery in the southern Great Barrier Reef, in an initiative by the Queensland Department of Environment. While shade cloths demonstrably result in proportionally more males being born, Raine's logistics are unwieldy. Consider 20,000 turtles arriving and departing all hours of the day, weeks on end over nesting season, which is also hurricane season. Having the right nest in the right area at the right time becomes a game of cat and mouse, unless human intervention extends to completely covering these so-called natural environments in shade cloth tents. While this is under consideration for Raine, due to the remote location and unwieldy topography, such structures would turn it into a triage centre, requiring round-the-clock vigilance on par with a hospital emergency ward. To circumvent these immediately above ground level problems, some suggest going further upwards, above the vicissitudes of shade cloths and endemic hurricanes. Precipitating artificial rain by cloud seeding is nothing new under the sun, though it prefigures planetary scale proposals to engineer the climate to avoid runaway climate change. Will BHP or another fossil fuel company sponsor such intervention? Does this not show up the ludicrous mindset of funding techno-fixes via the same industrial society that catalysed the rupture to begin with? In any event, both shade cloths or artificial rain are still only ephemeral interventions. While they are at the forefront of existing conservation experiments, they do not remotely amount to the seismic now that can avert the impending never. As regards this most vital rookery turned triaged emergency ward, ephemeral interventions are band-aids to the insoluble condition known as evolution. Given how precipitous the sex ratio already is, further proposals to systemically redress this sex ratio are far more insidious. In relation to turtle conservation, synthetic biology would entail discovering the genes that assign sex according to temperature, modifying them, then using gene drives to get the modification inherited across generations. For example, sand that is 29 degrees Celsius produces more females than males. At 33 degrees, all hatchlings are female. At 23 degrees, all hatchlings are male. Synthetic biology would modify the genome so that the eggs of future descendants would become male at a higher temperature, say 31 degrees. To date, no such research has been publicly proposed. Recall Attenborough drawing a line in the sand about stopping the birds and crabs from eating hatchlings on their journey from shell to sea. How would he, or younger generations of conservationists or environmentalists, draw a line in the sand about such conservation? In the currently unfolding rupture, such conservation can neither be reduced to a mere fantasy, nor can its prospects for yielding anything efficacious be considered even remotely real, nor commensurate with the timeframes available. A much larger historical legacy looms here also, one which concerns the complete tenure of turtles themselves. Throughout their existence, turtles have accommodated the comings and goings of things essential to their livelihood, such as nesting sites, the seagrass species they eat, currents, and ocean temperatures. Their adaptive capacity to avoid maximum sand temperatures includes nesting at cooler times of the year and changing to beaches with a lower solar albedo. The same being that is so insistent on returning to nest at its birthing beach, even when it proves perilous, is also able to collectively revise that instinct and switch to new times of the year and new locations when the time frame is sufficient to accommodate the gradual pace of such evolutionary change. Ironically, the turtle's instinct to return to their exact birthplace makes them less able to accommodate durational change, such as the comings and goings of entire rookeries. The antiquity of their tenure on Earth self-evidently attests to their ability to shift en masse to different islands, though their instinctive return to birth sites also attest to their propensity to nest in sites that have since become perilous. A rookery that disappears within a century may not provide enough time for turtle to shift en masse to a new breeding ground, but disappearance over a millennium may suffice. As always, adaptation is a matter of time. Same for a food source disappearing or ocean temperatures substantially changing. Yet seismic and catastrophic change of the stochastic and nonlinear variety is nothing but normal. A 2018 hurricane eviscerated an entire Hawaiian island that was a sea turtle refugia. Even if we set aside the inarguably just, but at this point ineffective game of pouring through fragments to determine the extent of human-induced amplification of that hurricane, shift happens just as shit happens. And yet, the time frame for playing dicey conservation games bears next to no relation to either saltation moments of evolutionary exuberance, such as when turtles adapted to prior rapid biophysical change, or atmospheric turbulence which could eviscerate rain in a single hurricane season. The game can in fact be squarely placed at the time frame between the rise of 19th century colonial and industrial activity and today. The seismic local impacts of the 1842 beacon construction and 1880s mining took 180 years to ensue. They offer scaled-down proxies for the cataclysmic planetary impacts stemming from the 5-decade lag between emissions and their demonstrable effects on the climate system. Caught, as we are, between historical emissions and contemporary attempts to deal with their aftermath, we can only foretell the greater volatility and vulnerability for respective abiotic and biotic bodies lies in the wait. Just as the legacy of 19th century human interventions into rain has been made manifestly apparent in the island's geomorphology, now there is no doubt about the anthropogenic legacy that foreshadows the future. For rain, such a spectre will come home to roost much later than any of its neighbours. Once climate change drowns all the surrounding islands, Hopley predicts that, quote, Raine Island is likely to be the last cay to disappear in the northern Great Barrier Reef, end quote.
This depends on the unique phosphate cap continuing to provide a bulwark against erosive ocean currents and coral continuing to replenish aggregating sediment, which in turn means that rain is ultimately dependent on the ongoing living and dying of coral. An end to living coral means an end to replenishing the dead coral which provide aggregating sediment piled into the raised area that makes rain's seashore, which in turn means that rain's story begins and ends with a rock, albeit a living rock of abiotic progeny, coral corpses. But rain's other story, the human one, begins and ends with another, different kind of rock, the beacon. That piled high aggregate of mined phosphate cap now stands at a maximum 7 meters above sea level. One day, when the rest of rain has gone under, a beacon poking up out of a flooded sea is all that will be exposed, its sociopathic means of creation thus obscured, and so of the myths by which the civilization of its day lived and died. Thank you.